Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists absolutely have it correct. This is Tom Navulis, your host, and I do want to apologize to you for last week. I didn't do a live program last week. We were extremely busy, and I was so crunched with time that there was no way that I was going to be able to produce something. As well as there were some glitches at Liberty Works Radio Network that actually ran my previous week's program. So the producers told me that I was excused for last week. But with that, I was able to get something to our friends down in Lima, Ohio, and reran a program for them. But today I am here fresh with you with some basic analysis of issue 1. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that here in Ohio. It was a constitutional amendment to, as many of you know, raise the requirements for approving a citizen-initiated constitutional amendment. Well, it failed here this past week on Tuesday, and I pretty much believe that it would. The underlying issue with it is that the media and all of the special interests that came into Ohio to defeat issue 1 had the financial backing to do just what they did. And it's going to be very interesting because one of the key elements that they used was that it was a single issue type of amendment to stop the abortion amendment that is coming up in November. Well, that's partially true. The other side of it, and this is the simplest way that I can bring it to you, is that in my lectures on the Ohio Constitution, I clearly bring out that the Ohio Constitution was amended in 1912. So the process began in 1910, a call for a constitutional convention, and all the amendments were voted on in 1912 and went into effect, and then has opened the door in Ohio for all the egregious amendments that are there. You see, the legislature in Ohio cannot even raise money without it being in a constitutional amendment. All of the higher education, Ohio State, road taxes, all the various taxes that are in Ohio generate from the constitutional amendments that went in place because the original the 1851 Constitution was very specific on the amount of debt that Ohio could carry. Whereas by amending the Constitution, that debt ceiling has continued to become a gross millstone burden upon the people. Now, with that, what happened during that constitutional convention was the progressives. So 100+ years later, what we see is the same ilk. The generations now of progressives, now Marxists, and there were Marxists back then as well, but the progressives, I'll just leave it at that, and those being the leftist, were the ones that pushed for the Constitutional Convention and the amendments that have been inflicting much pain upon the citizens of Ohio for these 100 years. With that, we had some of the so-called Republican they didn't call them conservatives, but the Republicans, the big business Republicans, the special interest Republicans, once again, went with the left. So that's why you had John Kasich going with the left against issue 1. Issue 1 was then promoted as a single issue, as I noted, in respect to what was going on the now November abortion issue. And the abortion issue that's there, go take the time to read the whole amendment and depth to it, will destroy the moral fabric of Ohio in totality. But that's a whole nother story. And most of you aren't all that interested in Ohio, except for the fact that Ohio, being a swing state, is very critical and was used by Eric Holder, if you remember, to push through an amendment here in Ohio that has caused nationally the redistricting debacle. This was Ohio, was the test case. Go look at Eric Holder's website on that, and you'll see that Ohio was the target for that. So, too, Ohio was a target to defeat protecting the Constitution. All of those that were saying that, and this is what the leftists were saying, the progressives were saying, is that, they were protecting the Constitution by keeping it a simple majority to pass an initiative. As I have mentioned before, I have worked on an initiative, and I have talked to people who worked on a constitutional amendment initiative, got one passed. And the fact is, here's the fact, and here's the deception that was there, is that it takes millions, a minimum of $5 million to get a constitutional amendment passed. Now, I haven't done the analysis on the flow of money, but let's just face it. The money that flowed in from all of the progressive, communist, leftist side outside the state of Ohio to defeat issue 1 was millions and millions of dollars to do that. So the point is, the Constitution is not protected because the general citizens in Ohio have no idea the cost to change it. So once again, only the special money interests will be able to pass a constitutional amendment in Ohio. Which brings me to the passions of men, the passions of mankind. The passions of mankind as it is brought under by, once again, my old friend here is Mr. DeTocqueville. For those that are watching, I'm holding up one of my copies. And DeTocqueville was very interesting in this one section where he's talking about the federalism, the federal aspect of the Constitution. And in discussing that federal aspect of the Constitution, some of the areas that he was talking about is the ingenious devices by which the system eludes the numberless difficulties resulting from a federal constitution. Now, where he's going with all of this is he's looking at and he's dissecting the Constitution, and what he drives here very specifically is that it was that the obligations created by the laws of the Constitution from those created by the laws of his own state, and that's dealing with the legislature. And in having to discriminate between these matters, it comes down to who is in control. And that at that time, the assumption was, and what was very clear to DeTocqueville, is that the federal Constitution was a fictitious item, that the states were the core, the states were the element, the states were the foundation of the nation. Not so true today. Again, the Anti-federalists predicted all of that, and we'll talk about some of that as well. What really got to the meat of it is that it was the moral and cultural and foundational aspects of the people that allowed federalism to function in America unlike any other place. And he brings out the example of Mexico, where Mexico at that time in the 1800s looked at the United States Constitution and determined, as de Tocqueville says, it's the most perfect constitution ever written. And Mexico tried to emulate it and put it together. But what they did not have, they did not have the clear sovereignty within their states. They did not have that clear sovereignty of the people within those districts. They did not have a liberty-minded, moral environment. They did not have that. Therefore, Mexico ended up a victim of anarchy and the slave of military despotism. De Tocqueville said that then. And now we have Mexico not only with the anarchy and slave of military despotism within their elections, but you have the drug cartels and the anarchy of the cartels because it became lawless. De Tocqueville also talks about, and he alludes to, that what's inherent in the federal system that could be considered a defect, the relative weakness of the Union. But yet, you're looking at this as it's a principle of all confederations that rest on divided sovereignty. That what is that confederation? And what we have is that the sovereignty of the states should be most effective. When that breaks down, as to which the Anti-federalists predicted, and as I've reviewed with you somewhat, is the bureaucratic state has now centralized the government to such an effect that these younger generations do not even understand the functions and purposes of the state governments except as an extension of the federal government. The only way that even de Tocqueville saw that the federal union could function is by the states continuing to maintain their sovereignty. But we don't have that now. We do not have that at this time. He says that the singular ingenuity in combining the restrictions of power of the Union within the narrow limits of the federal government with the semblance and, to a certain extent, with the force of a national government, this means that the legislatures of the Union have succeeded in diminishing, though not in counteracting, the natural danger of confederations. Ladies and gentlemen, we're supposed to have a small federal government. We're supposed to have a limited federal government. De Tocqueville saw that. He saw that as the most effectual way that we would be able to sustain as a nation. Well, in the next segments, I do have more to talk about with de Tocqueville, but I also have some more to talk about in relationship to why the conservative movement has failed very clearly why it has failed. And in addition to that, I am going to talk a little bit about J6 and some of the Trump debacles that are going on. Come on back for the next couple segments. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they got it correct. That's just bottom line on it. And again, this is Tom Navolis, your host. Appreciate you tuning in with me this week. And I want to bring to you just some remembrance of a couple key elements that I've talked about over and over and over again. And that relates back to the Kozak Plan. The Kozak Plan on how to take a democratic environment, and mostly within a parliamentary environment, and turn that into a communist, socialist, dictatorial environment. One that is a democratic Marxist country, which we have now. And it happened on January 6th. I want to bring that to you from a couple of the real key elements, and you'll have to go back, and I'll have here for you in the notes about the Kozak Plan and everything that I've talked about in that in the past. So it'll just be the search on the website, which is over my shoulder, samueladamsreturns.net, where you can get all the archives and the newsletter. But I want to take you to an article that was written back in, 2023, looks like March 12th. And it's called The Parliamentary Motive Behind the J6 Fedsurrection. And I'm not going to get into the total of the article, but this fits. It fits like a perfect glove. It fits like that perfect glove of how the Kozak Plan defines utilizing parliamentary procedure to take over a country and turn it into a Marxist environment. Now, this article, once again, I'll have the link, or the link is in there, and it's from the Conservative Treehouse. And what they really define in here is the mechanisms and the timing. Now, with this, I highly recommend, and I haven't had a chance to look at it yet because we were extremely busy, and as I mentioned last week, was extremely busy for us because we are starting and really are the Peppers for Fun jam business is getting good legs and starting to cause us to spend more time in the commercial kitchen, as well as the other rationale that I gave you in the first segment as to why I didn't do a program last week. But my program last week was going to be on the Kozak Plan and this other article that I'm going to bring to your attention here in a moment. But what happened is once again from this Treehouse article, the Conservative Treehouse, is that procedurally what occurred is that Nancy Pelosi stopped everything and Mike Pence stopped everything, which allowed for a mechanism to happen. Now, the stopping of everything goes to what I was going to mention a few moments ago before I went off onto a tangent, is that I have not been able to watch the Tucker Carlson newest release, and I think it's episode 15, where he does bring back in the former head of the Capitol Police, who reveals very much about the debacle on January 6th, and that it was a setup from his opinion, from his expertise of being the head of the Capitol Police. Now, when we look at what was going on and the fact that Antifa was involved, the FBI, we know now that their agencies were involved, this was a total setup. But why? Why was it a setup? It goes back to this article. Now, this gentleman who writes this article takes and outlines it, and this is then bringing it into that Kozak Plan of how does parliamentary procedure work and how does it affect what happened on January 6th. So is Mike Pence a traitor? Yeah, we'll find out so many more because he was in on this game and in on the game, and they'll keep the parties going. This is what DeTocqueville talks about, and I'll bring that back up in the third segment a little bit about what he talks about from the party structure and what occurs within that. So he asks, how do you prevent Congress from delaying the certification of state electoral vote? You use an emergency. Use an emergency that invokes special House rules. Okay? So an emergency that invokes special House rules. So you have to remember, and this is a fact here, that just moments before, literally 3 minutes, if you're watching the tapes and you go back to them, 3 minutes before two representatives issued a vote for motion to suspend the certification, the House members were informed by Capitol Police and other agents that the protest was about to breach the chamber. It was at this time that key people, Pence, Pelosi, Schumer, McConnell, can be seen walking out and escorted from the chamber. This effectively halted the entire chamber process. So that motion for suspension of certification never occurred because tactically and strategically this occurred. They were able to call this emergency. Why was it necessary to halt the chamber process? Because with the crisis, it eliminated the motion to challenge the certification and to begin voting to look into the voting requirements and fraud. That's what occurred. But instead, the two motions were completely legal and constitutional under at least two constitutionally recognized procedures that would have required the House to pause the certification and then vote to determine the motion of suspension. But what was so important to refuse this motion and the subsequent votes to suspend the electoral certification? And here's the answer. It was important to remove that process entirely and continue the fraud and certify the fraud with no detractors on record. That's it. No detractors on record. This effectively gives no standing for a SCOTUS ruling appeal. Grab onto that. That's why the Supreme Court said, well, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can look at. So those two motions, if they would have been successfully voted on, even if the motions were denied in vote, this gives those who presented them a standing for a constitutional legal argument before the Supreme Court. So with that not happening, then what could happen? And then it goes on, and you'll have to read the rest of this because I want to take you to another article. The rest is that under this, Pelosi unilaterally can, under emergency rules, suspend the business of Congress and then unilaterally, because of a crisis, create and invoke emergency procedures. Emergency procedures are that then which allowed what? The vote to be put into place. So when these new rules, the emergency rules, what other peculiar things occur when the Speaker reconvenes? Members were allowed to vote in proxy, remotely, and not present. This becomes a great debacle. And then this is a new session. It's considered a new session that Vice President Pence President of Congress would also have no ability to even consider pausing the electoral certification. So you can kind of give Pence a little bit of leeway there, little bit. That under these new rules, he had no authority to do anything. But was that planned? Was it? Think about it. Was it planned? So I would say go back and please look at this article that's there at SamuelAdamsReturns.net down in the references. And I think you will find the whole process. Read it through. Read what I had to say there and read through what was going on. So before I take you into the failure of conservatism, which is what I have here for third segment, really. There's an article here in the Gateway Pundit that I was going to talk about last week with the Kozak Plan and all of that. It's called History Repeats Itself. Democrats are using tactics of the Marxists of 1917 in Russia to steal America. Great article. Goes hand in glove, again, hand in glove with what I talk about when it comes to the Kozak Plan, which the Kozak Plan happened during that whole 40s and 50s time period. Now, here's some bullet points. Is that 2020, the perfect storm, is what was going on. All three branches of government in peril. Let's see, when was this article written? This article was written in August 6th of this year, of 23. And this goes back, and it goes back from just the steps on the preparation. Now, when we talk about what I said on the administrative state that started coming into effect all the way back in 1910, hello, Ohio, progressives, 1910, 1912, and on. The progressives then, 1917 in Russia. Geez, look at the timelines and the parallels of when we received and accepted the bureaucratic state and when the Marxist Revolution went into full effect in 1917. Interesting. But it really goes hand in glove with this, in that bureaucratic state and the educational system now builds in that you have the Jack Smiths, you have all of these leftist judges, you have all these leftist legislatures, you have the whack job in the federal government, that Congress that wears a bandana on his head. Anyway, here's the bullets I want to cover before we get here. Years of preparatory work were spent in misleading and misdirectional propaganda going on. Same thing happened here in Ohio. That wasn't years. That was on it. Contested voting results marred the election's finality and ultimately its dismissal. Going on. Claims that the poor were going to be disenfranchised of their vote. Always going on. The scheduled voting was extended by 2 months. And we're talking about in Russia as well as here. Division, violence, slander, and libel were widespread. A delusional, cunning, and conniving campaign made unrealistic promises to win the population. Anger and mob violence were deliberately stirred, Antifa and so on, Black Lives Matter and so on, against privileged possessions and status. Deceptive claims persuaded the majority that they were robbed of their electoral victory. Going on in Ohio, what happened as I opened the first segment with. Inevitable civil war was sparked at the elections and because Lenin's group failed to win a majority. And then the last bullet, and we'll pick it up in the third segment. The dissolution of the old state and transformation of a new system was promised to lead true socialism, but it brought history's worst and longest ruling tyrant. Ladies and gentlemen, Believe it or not, the Anti-federalists predicted what would happen in America under a constitution that became perverted by people's special interest. Come on back for the next segment as we continue this and more. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-federalists got it right. I'm going to go back to those other articles that I was discussing with you in relationship to history repeating itself, but I wanted to take and just bring a couple more points out of DeTocqueville to you. And the ones that he was talking about is that around the states that federalism only works when you have that dual sovereignty. And as I've mentioned before, is that the states have lost their sovereignty because what the Anti-federalists predicted is that we would have this coalescence of all government moving and authority moving into D.C. And with that is that it was destroying and has destroyed much of state sovereignty, although we have a good number of attorneys generals from the various states that are actually understanding how federalism should work and do take and file lawsuits against the federal government. But the bureaucratic state is so deep and so corrupt that what has happened is that to prevail is extremely difficult. So what he's talking about here is that an observation that he has is that when you take and you look around, that the federal government is in fact fictitious. It's only fictitious from the perspective that it is supposed to be very limited. It's supposed to function within the confines of the Constitution. But what we know is that that's no longer true. And when he was talking about that and these observations is that in that jurisdiction, once again, if the courts of the Union violated an important law of a state in a private case, the real, if not the apparent, contest would arise between the aggrieved state represented by a citizen and the Union represented by its courts of justice. And the reason he talks about that is he talks about this fiction and the legal fiction that is there, and the aid of it is to prevent men from finding out and employing the means of gratifying their passions, which have been left open to them because of the Constitution, because of the way things are governed. It may be doubted whether the American legislators, when they render collisions between the two sovereigns less probable, they destroy something that would be misfortunate. So when we're seeing and we're looking at these laws and what's going into effect, one of the commentaries and the Anti-federalists brought this out, and what DeTocqueville recognizes is that the federal government, and this was something that the young red-headed man from Virginia cried out in his Anti-federalist statement, that being Patrick Henry, is that, what do you mean, we the people? The original preamble to the Constitution listed every state. But when you put it, we the people, de Tocqueville goes, well, this is where the federal government is looking to act directly upon the people. And de Tocqueville recognized that. And he says, well, wait a minute. But the wait a minute is in that he goes, that's the job of the states, is to protect the people from the national government. We have a right to be represented in the national government, and yet the passions of men and women that get into the national government can throw it askew, which it is. And the bureaucratic state has totally destroyed it. But the fact of the matter is that's the purpose of the states, is our state sovereignty. If there's an action item And what we lost in Ohio is that whole state sovereignty because we lost issue 1. But you'll have to go back to the first segment to think about that again. Anyway, let's just, the last point here is that I wanted to bring out is that from DeTocqueville is that it's only once again the idea of a very moral and virtuous people, a people that understand, which the people at the time that he was here in the United States understood because they were active. And that's what he said. You can't be passive in government. You can't be passive in government. You have to be active. Otherwise, you will be subsumed and a slave of your government. The only safeguard which the American Union, with all the relative perfection of its laws, possesses against the dissolution which would proceed by a great war, lies in its probable exemption from the calamity, is the people. Is the people. You and I being engaged. We must have what he says here is that we must have the gifts and utilize the gifts of prosperity that we can gain and the knowledge of freedom. So with that, I only have a few minutes left. I want to take, for those that missed the second segment, quickly, we're going to go through where history repeats itself. Our problem is, and the destruction and the lack of functionality in the conservative movement and its failure, and I'm going to jump to that, is because we do not pay attention to history. And there's an article there, I'm not going to go through, but the points are the parallels of 1917 and what happened in Russia is here. To a note, and where I always talk about the Kozak Plan. Go to the second segment for those out of Lima that miss it. Please go there and listen to that second segment and read the article that's in your notes. Also, what I wanted to talk to you about very quickly in the J6 issues that I talked about there as well, look at the other articles where there is proof. So everything that this Jack Smith dude is talking about, he is the deceptive liar that is mentioned as the tactics that the communists used in 1917 and which Kozak also talked about. So that is all there for you to take a look at. Now, the article I want to talk about for the last 7 minutes here is Why Conservatism Has Failed by Claes Rinn. And this is in Law and Liberty. He is a professor at a Catholic university. Very good article. I'm going to give you the highlights. And up front, I'm not going to have time to really meld it together for you. But when we talk about Christian nationalism or we talk about the 2.0 of what it means from a Christian perspective in government. There's another book out there that's slipping my mind at the moment by Pastor Doug Wilson that I'll have for you in the references. But the conservative movement pretty much came about back in 1953 by Russell Kirk, and this is in the article, The Conservative Mind. Buckley, William F. Buckley Jr., he did the National Review in 55, and this started bringing together all of these ideas of the intellectual rationale for a political alliance of disparate groups, including libertarians, traditional Catholics, and other traditionalists. Intellectual consistency took a back seat to forge a rough political consensus. That's the crux of it. So the crux of it here in this opening paragraph of this essay which I highly recommend that you look at, is that what was missed in the William F. Buckley and Kirk and all of those goes deeper into what we see that occurred even during those early stages of the communists moving into Russia, and which we have seen over the many decades, almost 100 years here in America, is the destruction of our culture, our churches, our foundational faith. What is it from the perspective of art? What is it the perspective of poetry? What is it the perspective of all of the rest of the ties of human relations besides politics, besides single issues? The first person that I ever read or heard speak on this was Francis Schaeffer back in the 70s, about 75, 76 for me, in his book and movie series, How Should We Then Live? He went through the cultural destruction at that time. So here you have some 20 years after the National Review comes into effect, that Francis Schaeffer, in talking about the cultural revolution and that Christianity, in so many regards, was losing the battle, as well as conservatism losing the battle to a cultural revolution. Well, see, China did a cultural revolution. So we're talking about, and I mentioned in the second segment, what happened in 1917. But what was happening in the 1950s with the Chinese Cultural Revolution? No different than what happened and began to happen in America in the 60s and 70s. You see, we look at, and in this article, he talks about the movement reaffirmed the American system of limited, decentralized constitutional government. Yet, the moral, spiritual values that it saw informing the Constitution were fading in the universities and other American institutions like the churches. This cultural change ultimately threatened the rule of law and traditional liberties. In economics, the movement advocated free markets and fiscal discipline in government. You see, free markets is what Adam Smith, as well as, who else? Oh, it was the East India Trading Company that wanted free markets. Whereas, within the context of Christian nationalism, and the follow-through on that is fair markets. Fair markets. So even on a fiscal basis, conservatives have failed because of the grand Republicans and the same parties that I talked about 2 weeks ago in relationship to what does it mean in the difference of the oligarchs that we see now in the World Economic Forum as well in the other. Well, we're running out of time. So part of the failures, and I mean failures, of the conservative movement is this coalition building that we constantly try to do without the substance of the full extensibility of the gospel. So once again, I'll place it back on the churches for being evangelically blinded. They have the blinders on, and this goes back to exactly what Francis Schaeffer was talking about as well, is that we have to take the gospel and extend it to every aspect of life, every aspect of culture, of work, of business, of everything. Christ is Lord over everything. He's ascended. He's taken it all. He owns it all. Yet his body on earth, the church, does not act according to that which is in the prayer that he prayed, which we call the Our Father, and we do not understand his authority over all things which was given to him. Remember, he said all authority is his. Well, come on back next week when Sam Adams returns and the Anti-Federalists, yeah, they did. They got it right.